A drone strike in the dead of night. An American electronics plant in western Ukraine reduced to rubble, one person killed and more than 15 injured. These are the reported facts from the latest Russian assault. The fog of war always clouds details, yet the strategic contours remain clear enough. Moscow's method is persistence, attrition, and deliberate signaling. By striking civilian infrastructure and a facility tied to American industry, Russia demonstrates once again that it can reach any target inside Ukraine while warning the West that its involvement carries a price. President Volodymyr Zelensky declared that Moscow has given no sign of genuine negotiations. He demanded renewed pressure, tougher sanctions, harsher tariffs. His words are not empty rhetoric, but recognition of the strategic deadlock. Peace is impossible when one side calculates that endless casualties are an acceptable cost for imperial ambition. Moscow believes that it can outlast Ukraine and outlast the democratic world. Foreign Minister Sergey Lavrov reinforced this posture with words that were absurd yet revealing. He stated that Russia would only accept security guarantees for Ukraine if Russia itself were part of the system providing those guarantees. This is not negotiation. It is an attempt to turn occupation into legitimacy, to hold veto power over Ukraine's sovereignty. It reflects an imperial logic that peace in Eastern Europe must be guaranteed by Moscow or it does not exist. This recalls Soviet strategy during the Cold War, where arms control agreements and security talks were instruments for preserving spheres of influence, not dismantling them. At the same time, the Trump administration seeks an end to war. The White House continues to push for dialogue, for talks, for even the possibility of a trilateral meeting. But Russia maneuvers as if time is infinite. This is not simply war over land, it is war over endurance. Endurance of armies, of economies, of alliances. Moscow assumes that authoritarian persistence will outlast democratic unity. It is a gamble repeated through history. And it is a gamble that shapes every missile launched into Ukrainian skies. Yet Moscow miscalculated in one important respect. The invasion that was intended to fracture NATO instead accelerated its cohesion. The Trump administration has pushed European states to take responsibility for their own security. Germany now considers sending long-range Taurus missiles. Denmark debates closing the Danish Straits to Russian shadow fleets. Western capitals weigh converting $300 billion of frozen Russian reserves into weapons for Ukraine. The very measures Moscow sought to deter have now become real options. For Vladimir Putin, this war is no longer about Ukraine alone. It is about demonstrating that Washington cannot control Eurasia. This explains why the Kremlin bristled when the Trump administration helped settle the long-standing conflict between Armenia and Azerbaijan. Moscow perceived not peace, but intrusion. It understood the settlement as proof that the United States can still shape outcomes in what Russia calls its near abroad. Ukraine is therefore not only about territory, it is about credibility. The credibility of American power. The casualty figures underscore the stakes. More than 1 million Russian losses have been whispered in open reports. Such numbers would cripple most nations. Yet Russia persists. Why? Because Putin calculates that Western publics will tire before his own society does. He counts on division in European parliaments, on fatigue in the American Congress, on protests against tariffs and sanctions. The battlefield is not only in Donetsk or Kharkiv, it is also in Berlin, Copenhagen, and Washington. This dual battlefield explains why Lavrov's words matter. His demand for Russia to sit inside Ukraine's security guarantees is not negotiation. It is a tactic to fracture Western unity. If Germany hesitates to provide missiles, if Denmark declines to close the straits, if Washington balks at using frozen assets, then Moscow's strategy succeeds without battlefield victory. This is how attrition extends into diplomacy. It is the cold arithmetic of war in the 21st century. And so, in this first layer, we observe the immediate contest. Drones, missiles, statements, sanctions. But this is only the opening lens. To understand the full picture, one must zoom further out. The conflict in Ukraine is now the intersection of three strategic arcs. The first arc is Russia's bid to restore dominance over its former empire. The second is America's determination under President Trump to reassert leverage through tariffs, sanctions, and hard bargaining. The third is Europe's slow recognition that its security can no longer be outsourced. These arcs converge in the skies over Ukraine, and the world watches to see which arc bends and which arc breaks. The second layer of analysis reveals how warfare itself is changing. Russia's use of drones is not merely tactical. It represents a shift in how mid-level powers can sustain war. By producing drones in large numbers, often with Iranian components, Moscow can bypass the industrial limits that once constrained it. This reflects a global trend. Inexpensive technology now competes with expensive defense systems. For Ukraine, defending every city with advanced Western missiles becomes impossible when Russia can launch swarms of cheap drones. For the West, this raises an uncomfortable question. Can industrial democracies match authoritarian states in a war of production, or will costs and politics erode their ability to sustain? In parallel, tariffs and sanctions become weapons of another kind. President Trump has emphasized tariffs as a central instrument. They are not merely economic tools, but strategic levers. When Zelensky calls for strong sanctions and strong tariffs, he echoes this logic. Economic pressure becomes a second front. By targeting Russian oil exports, by freezing reserves, by sanctioning banks, the West seeks to erode Russia's ability to wage war. Yet sanctions also carry risks. Global markets react. Allies hesitate. Nations in Asia and Africa view Western sanctions as instruments of dominance. Thus, every economic measure deepens not only the Russia conflict, but the contest over the rules of globalization itself. A third layer involves diplomacy. Russia insists that peace talks must recognize its veto. Ukraine insists that sovereignty cannot be traded. The United States insists that talks are possible, but only if Russia signals genuine compromise. And Europe insists that its security depends on the outcome. These positions are not compatible. They form a deadlock where words serve as weapons. Lavrov's statements are not aimed at compromise, but at creating divisions among allies. Each time the West debates sanctions or missiles, Moscow inserts new demands, new delays, new conditions. This is negotiation as attrition. If we extend the lens further, history begins to cast its shadow. Russia has always framed its wars in terms of survival and spheres of influence. The Tsars spoke of defending Holy Russia. The Soviets spoke of defending socialism. Today, Putin speaks of defending the Russian world. In each case, the logic is the same. War is justified not by borders, but by identity. Ukraine threatens Moscow not because of its military power, but because of its orientation. A democratic Ukraine integrated with the West is an existential challenge to Russia's authoritarian model. That is why negotiations remain hollow. Moscow is not fighting for territory alone. It is fighting to prevent an alternative political model from thriving on its border. This brings us to the fifth layer, the role of American leadership. President Trump faces a strategic dilemma. His doctrine emphasizes ending endless wars, reducing commitments, demanding that allies take responsibility. Yet Ukraine presents a paradox. Ending the war too quickly risks rewarding aggression, allowing it to drag risks, exhausting the alliance. Thus, the Trump administration has pursued dual measures, pressuring allies to contribute more while retaining American leverage through tariffs and sanctions. It is a balance between burden shifting and dominance. And it is a test of whether Washington can still orchestrate outcomes without deploying massive ground forces. In this context, Europe's response is critical. Germany debates long-range missiles. Denmark debates straits. Each debate reflects a deeper shift. Europe cannot remain dependent on American security indefinitely. The Ukraine war has forced recognition that Europe must become a military actor, not only an economic one. This recognition may be Moscow's greatest unintended consequence. By invading Ukraine, Russia has awakened the very European power it sought to suppress. Yet the outcome is not predetermined. Much depends on endurance. Will Germany act? Will Denmark act? Will the United States sustain tariffs and sanctions if global markets recoil? Will Ukraine endure further waves of missiles and drones? These questions reveal that the conflict is not frozen. It is fluid, with every decision feeding into the strategic balance. Finally, the global implications must be drawn. Russia's war against Ukraine intersects with the contest between the United States and China. Beijing watches closely. It observes how Washington wields tariffs, how Europe debates missiles, how Russia absorbs losses. For China, the lesson is not only about Ukraine. It is about Taiwan, about the South China Sea, about the Belt and Road. If Russia endures and extracts concessions, China will conclude that persistence is rewarded. If Russia bleeds and loses leverage, China may recalculate. Thus, the Ukrainian battlefield is also a theater for Chinese strategy. And so the circle closes. A drone strike in western Ukraine is not only about 1 dead and 15 injured, it is about signaling, endurance, and global order. Moscow wants to prove that authoritarian persistence prevails. Kyiv wants to prove that sovereignty cannot be erased. Washington wants to prove that tariffs and sanctions can compel peace. Europe wants to prove that it can act as a security provider. And Beijing wants to learn which model of power will dominate the 21st century. This is the logic of the conflict. Cold, relentless, without sentiment. And it will continue until one of these forces bends or breaks.